You are listening to the Free Church, Free State podcast, Baptist theology for the common good.
Hey everyone, I want to welcome you all to the very first episode of the Free Church, Free State podcast. This is a project of the Carl F. H. Henry Institute for Evangelical Engagement at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which I'm privileged to be able to run. And obviously my name is Andrew Walker, and I am joined here by two of my closest friends in the world, Casey Hough and Josh Wester. They'll give their own respective introductions here in a second. But let me just say, we're doing this podcast because we are all convictionally Baptist. And we want for there to be a distinctly Baptist approach to politics, to ethics, to culture. And as we kind of survey the landscape right now, there's a lot of conversation about evangelical engagement, which we're for and we want to promote. But we want to think about this distinctly as Baptists as well. And so the whole notion of the podcast, Free Church and Free State, that comes from the Baptist Faith and Message 2000, which we'll get into a little bit more this particular episode. But before I give more of an overview of what this podcast is going to look like, Josh and Casey, why don't you guys take a few moments to introduce yourselves and to give your own perspective on why we're doing this podcast?
Josh, go ahead, brother.
All right. Well, I was going to defer to you, but I'll go ahead and jump in. Listen, this is a lot of fun to be able to do a podcast with two of your best friends. And we're doing this, as Andrew just said, because, listen, we're Baptists. We think Baptists have a very important role to play in the public square and in the conversation. And so we're excited to be able to spend time with you regularly thinking as Baptists about what's going on in our world and in the culture and what that means. Andrew said that the Free Church, Free State comes directly out of the Baptist Faith and Message. It does, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But that's been with us since the Baptist Faith and Message was adopted in 1925. And it is a part of, it is kind of central to how Baptists think about the proper relationship between church and state. And so you're going to get a lot of that on this podcast. I've been friends with these guys for many years. My relationship with Andrew started with an email that I sent when I was like an intern at a state level, public policy organization, and just said he was working at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission at the time. And I was basically just like, hey, will you talk to me? Will you be my friend? Will you put up with me sending you emails? And along the way, I met Casey, and man, these guys have become like best friends to me, and I've learned so much from them, and I'm excited to learn from them as we do this together.
Yeah, Josh, thanks, brother. My name's Casey Hough, and I am a lead pastor down here in Houston, and also professor of biblical interpretation. Looking forward to being part of this podcast for all kinds of reasons. One is that there's a concern I have as a pastor for there being a more robust, distinctly Baptist understanding of why we advocate for religious liberty, why we hold that conviction. And I'm grateful to be able to do this with two brothers that are highly qualified to be able to talk about it. I'm grateful for just an opportunity to wrestle with these things, especially in a culture that a church culture that I think struggles to understand this distinctive. And then also just a culture, a secular culture that is not as inclined to receive it. And they look at it as an excuse for some sort of discrimination or whatnot. And I think that misses the heart of this ideal, especially regarding religious liberty today. So very much looking forward to being a part of this, and couldn't think of two better guys to do it with than Josh and Andrew. And so. Josh, I will say I'm glad to hear that whenever you reached out to Andrew, you actually responded to your text messages. So that's good to hear.
I'm blessed and highly favored.
So actually, Josh, you're so humble and so godly that you failed to give like any introduction to how you make money, how you serve the kingdom. So give us a glimpse of like, what are you doing right now in your life? Who might be, your most looked to role model, like your doctoral advisor, and kind of what you're studying type thing.
Yeah, I was waiting for that to work its way in. To circle back. So my name is Josh Wester. I am currently I'm a pastor on staff at Redemption Church here in Mobile, Alabama. I've been doing that for the last 6 months or so, but mostly my role is I'm chief of staff to the SBC president, and that's not a job that you really train for. It's just one of those things that happens. So my role is like all Southern Baptist Convention all the time, and it is, man, it's a lot. Before that, I guess to train for that, I spent about 4 years working full time at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. That's really where my relationships with both Andrew and Casey really were solidified, and these friendships really just came to be very meaningful parts of my life. In terms of academic preparation, so I did my MDiv at Southern, and Andrew and I overlapped briefly, but I don't know if we ever even met each other there. I went on to do a THM at Southeastern, where I worked on specifically like the tradition of classical liberalism and what does the Baptist tradition have to say to kind of this Lockean version of liberalism. And I did my thesis on that. And now I'm at Southern Seminary, where I'm working for Andrew, who in that context is Dr. Walker, which is, as painful as it sounds.
But not on this podcast.
But not on this podcast. And he's my doctoral supervisor, and I'm going to continue to work in the area of Baptist political thought and Christian ethics. And I'm super, super excited about that. That's a little bit about how I got here in terms of background.
Yeah. And let me go ahead and kind of also tease out one aspect of this podcast that I think could be of particular interest is I mentioned that this is going to be a podcast dealing with big picture Baptist public theology or political theology issues. So that necessarily means ethics, culture, politics. But in particular, we kind of want to have a devoted attention to the notion of ethics. I teach ethics at Southern Seminary. Casey did a PhD with a minor in ethics, and then Josh is doing an ethics and public theology PhD at Southern Seminary. So all of us actually have focused training in ethics, and ethics is its own unique discipline. It's not systematic theology. It's not exegesis. It includes all of those categories. And one of the reasons I love ethics is I think it's one of the most integrative disciplines kind of in the broader field of Christian thought. But we want to try to bring some distinctive Baptist flavor to this project that we call ethics, which often people have misunderstandings what ethics is really about. So we'll get into that more as the show goes. But let's talk about how we're going to structure all of these shows and episodes. Because we're good Baptists, we've broken this show down into an alliteration around the word R. We don't have a particular affinity for the word or the letter R, but it's just what kind of stuck. So kind of every single episode, we're going to have what we call the rundown, the rabbler, the roundtable, the review, and the revelry. So let me unpack what all of those sections of the podcast are going to be. The rundown is going to be kind of a download of news and events from that week in terms of what's happening in the world around us that we think Baptists might have something to say and speak into that particular issue. Another part of the podcast is going to be what we call the rabbler. And the rabbler is going to be not every single episode, but we plan to bring on guests, Baptists and non-Baptists. We're going to subject them to Baptist interrogation, and we're going to stir the pot. We're going to get some debate going. It's not going to be people who always just agree with us. So we will have interviews occasionally. And then third, we're going to have what we call the roundtable. And that's probably going to be like, for example, today, where we spend most of our time's focus. And the roundtable is where we're going to be having some type of topical discussion around some issue related to Baptist political theology. And that actually brings us, I think, to what I think actually might be one of the more innovative parts of this podcast. We want this podcast to actually be participatory. Most podcasts are something that you download and listen to at your own leisure. We're going to do that, but we're also going to tell you at the end of each show about a document that we're going to have read by the next episode so that you can read the document as well. Because what we want to do every single episode is take some document from Christian history that is related to public theology issues, and we're going to have a roundtable discussion on the document in question, where we agree with it, where we disagree with it, and then at the very end of that section, we're going to tell you, okay, hey, so 2 weeks from now, because we're going to try to have 2 episodes a month. 2 weeks from now, we're going to be reading this particular document. So if you want to be ready for the next episode, in your off time, find time to read this particular document. And we intend to show you or to give you a link to the show notes where you can go and find this document. So that should be somewhat, I think, perhaps, again, participatory and a fun way to invite the audience in to kind of work through classic documents of political theology. And then we're going to have a section of the podcast called The Review, which is more or less a time for us to kind of basically think through what's caught our attention from that week. It could be news related, but it could be something that there's an article that we saw. There's a provocative tweet that we saw that we want to discuss. It could be what we're reading. All 3 of us are devoted readers. And so I often know that I find the greatest value in other podcasts from listening to their recommendations for what they're reading. And so we want to do the same for you all, for this to be a place where we aren't simply just conversant with the big ideas, but that we're engaging and wrestling with them, interrogating them. And that means we have to necessarily be readers. And then the last section of a podcast episode is going to have what we call the revelry, which is where it's just going to be kind of, closing thoughts about some fun miscellaneous issue. This could be, is there a new app that you've found that has really revolutionized your life in some capacity? Is there some new study hack that you've utilized that's saving you a bunch of time? This is basically just kind of what's fun and intriguing that's gotten your attention. So that's the idea for the Free Church, Free State podcast. This is a Baptist political theology podcast. I mentioned this at the very beginning of the episode, but the sponsor of this project is the Carl F. H. Henry Institute for Evangelical Engagement at Southern Seminary. I'm privileged to run that center, and we're doing this podcast in the spirit of Carl F. H. Henry, who himself was a Baptist, even though he's kind of known as this broader pan-evangelical. And what Carl F. H. Henry stood for was a truly robust, orthodox, confessional Christian public witness out in the public square, but that was also simultaneously, relentlessly sane. And that's what we're missing a lot right now in our current moment is extremes kind of driving the conversation. And so we're all convictional, evangelical, Protestant conservatives, but we want to inject some sanity into the conversation as well. So, gentlemen, we are now at the part in the podcast that we are calling the rundown. And so I'm going to pitch it to Josh and just say, like, what are the news and events from the week that you think we should be paying attention to?
Well, let's start with what people aren't paying attention to, and that's the Olympics. So, we're in this weird thing where the Olympics are always this kind of like, it's a national moment. It's a thing that everybody is kind of paying attention to. And these are the least watched Olympics in recent history and maybe in modern history.
Right.
And that has everything to do with China. And so bringing it all the way, directly back into the Baptist theology world, we are talking about a government that is this oppressive, I mean, really brutally oppressive regime. And notably, I mean, the Southern Baptist Convention back in June at their annual meeting in Nashville passed a resolution
Right.
speaking out against and calling the world and particularly the leaders of the U.S. government to oppose the Chinese government's, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of the Uyghur people. And we know that by the millions, they have been putting these people in internment camps, that the State Department has classified this a genocide. And as a result of that, the world has decided to kind of turn its back on this Olympics, which is so unfortunate for these athletes who have
Right.
worked their entire lives. It's nothing. It's not to take anything away from them, but honestly, it is just it's staggering. I feel like this is more than 50 years ago, where the world is watching the Olympics take place in Germany,
Right.
And everybody's just asking why. Why is this happening?
Well, so let me add to that. I mean, we probably remember a couple of weeks back. I forget the gentleman's name at this point, but he's like this billionaire venture capitalist. He owns part of the Warriors, and he did this podcast where he basically says, like, "Hey, just being honest with you all, no one cares about the Uyghurs. I simply don't care. It's on my on the things that are garnering my attention. Literally, it's not on there at all." And that was such a revealing comment, right? I mean, it speaks to the ironies and contradictions of our particular age. You have someone, oh goodness, I wish I could figure out his name right now. Maybe one of you guys can figure out who it is. Who is, the NBA, kind of the corporate world is all about social justice, right? It's social justice in every possible venue being shown to you. It's bringing attention to the plight of the oppressed and the marginalized. And I just find it to be so richly absurd that you have individuals who will play up the social justice narrative in an American context because there's a political lobby behind that and a political expectation that you say certain things. But then when, the mic is off, so to speak, but the mic was actually on, you have someone basically saying, I really don't care about the Uyghur Muslims. I really don't care about these atrocities that are happening. And the reason he doesn't care about those atrocities is because, guess what? I'm guessing this individual has financial stakes in the CCP's operations in terms of its business corporate models over there. So I think this is just one area where, like, as we think about doing Christian ethics and Baptist public ethics, the issue of consistency and integrity is paramount here. That, like, we don't get to pick and choose what we advocate for simply by virtue of, oh, well, it's popular to do that here, but it's going to hurt my financial bottom dollar over there.
That's so good. And I mean, we've watched the NBA struggle with this really for years now. I mean, they have, this guy that you're referring to was a part owner of the Golden State Warriors who had to come out and distance themselves from this guy. I have his name here, but I can't say it, so I'm not even going to give it a shot. But he's a part owner. Then you had the situation where the Houston Rockets, somebody spoke out against China and immediately had to reverse themselves because of all of the pressure that came down. And you have these, NBA players basically being forced to kowtow to China, and you have another NBA player who has been really on the front lines of trying to speak out against this, to draw attention to this, and one of our friends, somebody that we know, was on the early days of this, just holding up a sign at an NBA game that said "Google Uyghurs." That was just trying to draw attention to this. And so the NBA
got kicked out of the NBA game for doing
that. That's right. And it has everything to do with, the NBA has so many financial ties to China because it's such a big market for them that they are at all costs, literally, protecting that market share.
Yeah, I think y'all both nailed the hypocrisy that is inescapable. Which, in one sense, what's troubling is there are certainly injustices within society that ought to be condemned and dealt with. but whenever you're only willing to condemn the one that affects the bottom line, or you're willing to dismiss and ignore the one, I mean, it guts it in one sense. It guts legitimate concerns that are raised about certain things, and so um, it's I feel like it's ridiculous. Like you can't talk about justice in society the way they're talking about it and turn a blind eye to the types of abuses that are taking place. And if that's what you're inclined to, just keep your mouth shut about these types of issues, which I don't think that's what they're going to do, because there's big business to be found in that type of virtue signaling. But if you're not going to defend the right to life of an entire people group within China because it hurts your business, then just be honest. Which, that's the thing about the owner for the Golden State Warriors. You know, um, he said the quiet part out loud.
That's right.
Right.
And anyways, that it's irritating because it's all couched in this idea of we care, when in reality what we care about is our money. We care about our profit.
I mean, it's the notion of kind of this woke capitalism. There's a book out by Vivek, I forget his last name, but it's a fascinating book talking about like looking at kind of Silicon Valley's concern for justice issues, and it's really about enlisting people's dollars. That's not about that they actually are going to do anything to affect change. I think, maybe the last thing we should say about this here is when you pick and choose what you're going to apply the category of social justice to, and you do that arbitrarily, it really undercuts the seriousness of your labeling of social justice on the very thing that you think actually is worthy of social justice.
Absolutely.
Because the whole notion of biblical justice is it's uniform. It's a principle of equality. And so obviously, like, I'm not saying that all issues of social justice are issues of hypocrisy. Not at all. There are issues we should care about as Christians. But we have to bring equal weight and equal measure to all offenses, not just the ones that are kind of pet projects. Let's talk about this for a second. Okay.
Hey, Andrew, let me give you answer just real quick, just to jump back on that. And this might be, I'll speak for myself in this regard. And I think you guys would agree. When someone or an organization fails to recognize the greatest social injustice of our day, which is the systematic dismembering and killing of children in the womb, and you have no concern whatsoever for life from conception to natural death, that when you can't speak to that type of thing, but you only want to speak to the thing that's in the headlines for the Times or Washington Post, when that is what's driving your concern, you have abandoned, in my mind, a biblical concern for justice. Justice, at the heart of justice, is not to show partiality, and I think that would include the issues of our day as well. And so I just I have a concern for that. There should be a consistency in the way that we think about those things. Otherwise, it's an injustice regarding the way we even speak about them.
Yeah, Josh, I've heard you say the phrase that like consistency is the currency of moral authority. You've got to have it on all sides, right?
That's good.
All right. So as we're recording this, there is like as much of a revolution happening in Canada as you would ever expect the polite, nice people of Canada to engage in. What the heck is going on with these truckers, and are they going to interrupt the Super Bowl, as I saw potentially headlines suggesting they might do so? Josh, go with you first.
Yeah, I mean, I've just followed this. Honestly, it's fascinating. Geopolitics are not really my strong suit, but as I'm looking just to our friendly neighbors to the north, this is a protest over COVID restrictions. And listen, I think that each of us have tried to speak carefully as we have addressed various contingencies around COVID. Okay, it's complicated, and a lot of it has to do with it's different by location, and it's different for a whole host of reasons. But clearly, there has been considerable, let's say, chafing at the constant. The constant need to keep up measures that ordinary people in their lives are beginning to see, hey, these are totally unnecessary to me in order to remain healthy or stay safe or protect me and my family, but also live my life. And so we just saw that in a different way where, I don't know if you guys saw this video of the kids in the classroom in Las Vegas. They were told they could take their masks off. Finally, they didn't have to wear masks at school anymore. And they ripped them off and started cheering, which just told you, if you were wondering how people were feeling or even how children were feeling about, being at this point in the pandemic, if we still call it that, at this point, still forced to wear a mask, they were overjoyed. So going back to the truckers, Canadian truckers have taken it upon themselves to basically stage a protest. They have been blocking borders with their trucks, and there is this kind of massive movement that has happened there. And listen, I don't know the ins and outs of it enough to comment one way or the other, but I definitely see it as a sign that people are weary of heavy-handed restrictions, and that seems to be what's driving all of this. If you'll pardon the pun.
Yeah, well, I think that brings up, it seems like the week that we're recording this, this is Friday, February 11th. It seems like in the media, there is a reckoning that the Democrats are having with COVID protections and COVID measures, especially around masks. And I feel like I don't think anyone's come out and said this, but it seems to me that the science is evolving as 2022 midterms get closer. And so it feels as though there's something happening in the air from just like a pure political polling perspective that makes me think that the pandemic might actually be over right as we get to November. Thoughts on that?
How convenient, right?
How convenient. Trust the science, Casey. Trust the
did
science.
Did anybody see that coming?
See, I think that's an interesting point because remember back to the 2020 election where there was so much speculation, particularly from people who were like further to the right, that said, oh, well, we all know this is all going to be gone the day after the election happens, as if COVID was merely a political ploy in order to affect the election. I think at this point, standing from our current vantage point, we can say that wasn't the case, right? Like it was real. It really threatened people. It threatened certain people more than others. But it obviously, it's had a global impact. This was not something that was narrowly focused to the United States, but we are more than 2 years in now. We are ready to, the world is ready to find a way to cope and to move on. And I definitely think now there's a political calculation. You're seeing, Republicans, obviously, for the most part, were much more eager to move on and return to normal life. And there was just a stronger push on the left to organize our lives around this new COVID reality. But the politics of all of that are changing. And like you said, there is an election coming up. And yeah, I'm pretty clear-eyed about what's going on there.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about what types of things are going to remain and what types of things are going to change back to normal. When I think about that, or what we talk about the terms of new normal. It's hard to ever imagine a government that likes to give back any power that it's handed over. So, but there's some things that have come out of this that I hope stick around. There are things about shopping and things about time at home and flexibility that have been good to enrich the lives of people. But in the flip side of that is I'm interested to see how the government. I'm in Texas, so I have a good idea how the state of Texas is going to do it. But I'm interested to see how will a government that is not prone to hand power and freedom back to people handle this. That's going to be interesting. There's I hope that I hope that it's less partisan, but I'm not as I'm not incredibly hopeful in that regard.
Yeah, just before we move on from the kind of what caught our eye or what news are we paying attention to? I mean, right before we started recording this podcast, we saw this AP report come out that said abortions in Texas have fallen by 60%
Right.
in the first month that this pro-life legislation has been allowed to take effect. And you just, man, I mean, as a person who's worked in the pro-life movement, all of us have to varying degrees. Man, that is unbelievably encouraging on so many different fronts. I mean, firstly and primarily, you see that, man, there are 60% less children died in Texas as a result of this legislation. So praise God for that.
Mm-hmm.
You also see that this kind of incremental legislation works if you're allowed to implement it. And so obviously all of our eyes are watching the Supreme Court and what they're going to end up doing in the Dobbs v. Jackson case. And so anyway, just something to pay attention to and to thank God for as we are continuing to watch the future of this play out.
Yeah, and let me just push too regarding the narrative that you're going to hear from some that says, because there's going to be a reduction in abortion, who's going to take care of these kids and whatnot? It's just kind of a consistent trope from some that say the church is only pro-birth but not pro-life. It's just simply not true. If you look at the work that nonprofits and churches are doing within the state of Texas, what you're going to see is a commitment to caring for mothers and their children. And so just is anybody listening to this and hearing that may be inclined to say, well, what are going to happen to those children? Those children are going to be taken care of because the people that I know that are pro-life are consistently pro-life from birth to natural death. And it's just simply not true that mothers and these children are going to have to suffer because they weren't allowed to get an abortion. That is ideological. That's an ideological comment that has no grounds in actual truth and experience. And if you talk to pro-life people here on the ground, they are committed to those children and those mothers flourishing. So
yeah, that's a good word.
Ryan Anderson, he made a really provocative statement after the Dobbs oral arguments. He said, if Roe's overturned, that's not really the end of the pro-life movement. It's really the beginning of a new type of pro-life movement. It's putting our our money where our mouth is and showing up to say, like, make abortion unthinkable, right? Mm-hmm. Like we no longer have to have a society where if a woman thinks she can't have a child, that she would need to abort a child. Like let's make that unthinkable. So, all right, let's move to the roundtable discussion. And since this is episode 1 of the Free Church, Free State podcast, we thought we had to, by virtue of duty and obligation, go to Article 17 of our beloved Baptist Faith and Message, which is on religious liberty. Before I read this article, let me just say this. At the risk of us literally going on the rest of the day talking about religious liberty, because we have all written lengthy things on this, let's just leave it at this by saying, if there is anything that is distinctly Baptist, it is religious liberty. So this is something that we're not just kind of piggybacking off of. I don't think that you have the First Amendment take the shape that it does if you don't have John Leland. You may not have John Leland if you don't have Roger Williams, and yada, yada, yada. It goes back into history. Something in our DNA has this language of dissent and freedom built into it. So I know these will be issues that we are literally working out the implications of the rest of this podcast series, however long into eternity it goes. But let's just kind of offer that as some pretext. But here is Article 17 of religious liberty. And Josh, I'm going to go ahead and give you a heads up. I'm going to go to you for the first comment after this. So here we go. God alone is Lord of the conscience, and he has left it free from the doctrines and commandments of men, which are contrary to his word or not contained in it. Church and state should be separate. The state owes to every church protection and full freedom in the pursuit of its spiritual ends. In providing for such freedom, no ecclesiastical group or denomination should be favored by the state more than others. Civil government being ordained of God, it is the duty of Christians to render loyal obedience thereto in all things not contrary to the revealed will of God. The church should not resort to the civil power to carry on its work. The gospel of Christ contemplates spiritual means alone for the pursuit of its ends. The state has no right to impose penalties for religious opinions of any kind. The state has no right to impose taxes for the support of any form of religion. A free church and a free state is the Christian ideal, and this implies the right of free and unhindered access to God on the part of all men, and the right to form and propagate opinions in the sphere of religion without interference by the civil power. All right, I finished reading that, and I'm reading it in a spirit of Mel Gibson from Braveheart, when he's like got the flag on the horse, he's carrying it into battle. That's like what's going through my mind. Leave aside all of the militaristic overtures of that. Don't read too much into that. I'm just simply saying this gets the blood flowing as a Baptist. Josh Wester, reactions to Article 17 of our beloved Baptist Faith and Message.
Yeah, man. Well, I'll start by saying I think you were talking about the Patriot and not Braveheart.
Oh, wait. Yeah, sorry. There we go. Whatever.
Everything else, not that distinction notwithstanding, you're exactly right about the spirit of this. I mean, to be totally selfish for a second, my entire thesis, I was trying so hard to build out like what do Baptists think about the state, and I was looking through all this stuff in history, and man, like I wrote pages and pages and pages, and ended up saying, yeah, it's right there in this article in the Baptist Faith and Message. This is like Article 17 this is what Baptists believe about the state, and that this is particularly important right now. I mean, this is, only one word, one phrase was changed from the 1925 version of the statement. And that was at the very beginning. It said the state owes to every church. And before it said the state owes to the church. And so they were just kind of flexing their Baptist localism there by saying every church. But this is so important because right now we're at a time where kind of the foundations of American democracy are being questioned by those on the right and the left. Right. The classical liberal tradition is being, really interrogated right now. And so that's Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. Adrian Vermeule's got this new book, Common Good Constitutionalism, coming out. And so as Baptists, this week, and so as Baptists, we have to look at this and say, okay, well, how does our theology and our belief about the separation of church and state and about the critical importance of religious liberty because of the way we think salvation works, how does that affect the way that we see government and the way that government is put together? And so this is a very timely conversation. And if you've never, done a deep dive just on these, on this one paragraph, you've got a great summary of what it is that Baptists contend about the state.
So I'm going to make a statement, and I want you guys to react to the statement. So Baptists want basically immorality, crazy ideology, insane religions to just absolutely run amok. You're telling me that all of these viewpoints deserve equal representation in society, and the state cannot be committed to any type of real moral foundation. True or false?
That's false.
Shocking.
Yeah. That's, part of what we're aimed at. The advocacy for religious liberty as a Baptist does not mean that you have no regard for common good, the flourishing of humanity, or that you deny very clear examples, not only from within God's word, but from within creation itself regarding expectations, the conscience of mankind as it reveals a concern for morality. No, we want a just and moral society. And the reality of it is our neighbors want a just and moral society as well. Everyone actually wants a just and moral society. They may not all agree with what they mean by they want it good and evil, but everybody wants their neighbors to believe that it's wrong to rob, to steal, to kill, to commit adultery, things like that. And Baptists are no different in that regard. What we're saying is that we do not believe that the church or any type of religious organization ought to be supported by or supporting a civil structure, as if that is a key aspect of our religious identity. The church does not need the state, although I would say that the state does need the church in some ways, and that's not a violation of a principle of religious liberty. Josh, it looks like you got something. I'll let you throw in there, but those are initial thoughts. That's a caricature of the idea of liberty. That's what that is. That's taking the idea of liberty and freedom and turning it into a libertarianism, which is not actually historically or theologically the idea of liberty that a Baptist has in mind.
No, that's so good, Casey. And I'll go ahead and throw this out there because he's too humble to do it himself, or we just won't make him do it. But Andrew's got this book, Liberty for All, which has been out for a little while now, that maps this Baptist distinctive of religious freedom. It's excellent. I've read it multiple times, both by choice and by force, and I would encourage you to get a copy of it.
You didn't have the liberty to not read that, did you?
That's right.
I coerced you into reading it.
But I just throw this out there and say, listen, sometimes we hold to beliefs and they're kind of thin. Like if somebody asks you why, you might have one or maybe two lines of argument to say that. But I think as a Christian and as a Baptist, man, I have so many good reasons to believe in religious liberty. So like I believe in religious liberty because I believe in evangelism. I don't think all worldviews are equal. I don't think they're morally equivalent. In fact, I think that the gospel is the best news, the best story that's out there. And I just want Baptists and Christians to be free to tell it because I'm not afraid of how Christian truth will do in the public square when it's held up against other beliefs. I believe in religious liberty because of what I believe about baptism. I don't want the state telling me that I have to baptize my children. I believe the Bible says we baptize believers. And so that's something that the state has to stay out of. It's because of what I believe about salvation. I believe in religious liberty because I'm a conservative. And I think the government is generally bad at doing anything. And I definitely don't want it doing spiritual things.
Right.
So that's one reason. And the last reason is I believe in religious liberty because I understand history, and my forebears were drowned and put into stocks and beaten. And I don't want to go through that. And I don't want that for my children.
Yeah. That's well said. I mean, there's two basic categories here that I don't think that like the church state establishment model is either theologically justified on the one hand, that's the overarching principle. But then I would also say like, show me where in history that you have had what you so-called desired and that it has gone well for either the church or the state. It hasn't. I mean, there's no argument that says, oh, we ought to go back to this particular thing. It has, I think it accelerated the collapse of Christendom in Western Europe by making membership coterminous with the state and the church itself. The kind of them serving each other, this kind of mutually reinforcing relationship. And then I think it's corrupted religion as well, because it sends the signal that to be Christian is to simply participate in this amorphous thing called culture. Now, there's some nuance here. I'm not a Baptist who wants to like just blanketly criticize Christian culture. Please hear me. Like I actually want Christian culture. But I think it's having Christian culture properly understood, meaning that the norms of a culture are influenced by Christian ethics, not that someone simply considers themselves Christian by having grown up in that particular culture. And then let me just say this too, from the desirability thesis of this. I can understand on the one hand why something like having the godly magistrate in charge of society is definitely appealing, right? We obviously want moral justice seeking magistrates. Okay, well, yes, but that's all great and wonderful until you have a heretic in office, right? I mean, do any of us want Justin Trudeau or Joe Biden issuing any type of religious truth claim? No, I don't, because I think Justin Trudeau is, just generally insane. And then Joe Biden doesn't even believe his own teachings of his own church. So the idea that we're going to have this top-down idealistic system where you're going to have a bunch of like regenerate Sunday school teachers serving as your senators and your president, I think it's utopian. And I think that gets to the underlying idealism around kind of whether you call it Christian Reconstructionism, you call it theonomy, or just basic general church-state union models.
Yeah, I think too. There is a misunderstanding of religious liberty within even the evangelical world, or people that critique certain aspects of this idea. Um, in particular, so someone will say, "So you agree with religious liberty? Does that mean that you're indifferent to the religious condition of those around you?" Um, as if really what religious liberty equals is advocacy for some sort of pluralism, like a committed religious pluralism, not just a societal pluralism where people are different. I want all of my neighbors to be Christian. What do I mean? What do I mean by that? I do not want all my neighbors to be Christian because the government tells them you're a Christian because you're a member of the citizen. I want all my
That's
neighbors
right.
to be Christian because I want them to believe and trust in the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
I I don't want them to all be Muslim, not because I hate Muslims or because I'm scared of Muslims, but because I'm a Christian. I believe in the power of the gospel. I want them to trust. So religious liberty doesn't mean that I'm indifferent to spiritual people around me, which is a mischaracterization. It's this idea of religious liberty sending people to hell. No, not for a chance. That's not at all what the idea means. The idea is that I want the government to stay out of things that don't belong to it. And I
Right.
have such a confidence in the power of the gospel, is that the power of the gospel is going to convert my neighbors because that's what the gospel does. And so one of the things that I love about a distinctly Baptist understanding of religious liberty is the fact that it's rooted in my conviction that there's not a lost soul in my neighborhood that the gospel cannot reach and change. And so ultimately, it's religious liberty is downstream from my conviction of the need for people to be born again.
That's right.
And that's part of the problem with so much of of kind of a reconstructionism is the thought is that what we just need is a moral society. And that's a caricature. They won't receive that. But the idea being is that really what my neighbors need more than anything is not simply to be influenced by Christian culture, but they need to be transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit. And I want the best environment for that to take place in to be one where there's religious liberty, and the government recognizes that where it's Caesar in some regards, it's not Caesar the soul, and that it belongs to Christ. And so, um, yeah, I it's a misnomer for people to say that religious liberty means that you are not committed to seeing people saved and that you don't want people to be you want people to go to hell because you're endorsing their pluralism. No, that is not what it means historically, theologically, or any practical way whatsoever. um, I think we have to move past the caricatures of what it means to be committed to religious liberty and recognize that it's deeply rooted in a confidence in the gospel and an understanding of the kingdom of God.
I think that's so good, Casey. That's a really well-developed kind of theology of religious liberty. And just one more practical point: we don't want our neighbors to think they need to identify with Jesus so they can be on the right side of the state, right? Like that. That's how you make false converts. I totally agree with Jonathan Leeman, who has a great book. He has like Political Church, which is more academic, but his like layman's book on Baptist political thought is called Why the Nations Rage, and I would encourage you to pick that up. But in that, he has this motif. He talks about how the public square is a battleground of gods, and I think that's right. I think it is a battleground of gods. But when you serve the living God, you're in pretty good shape to go into the public square. So that's kind of my thought on religious liberty, is to say, hey, if you're a Christian, you should absolutely support religious freedom, because the Christian gospel stacked against any other kind of truth is always going to prevail.
Yeah. Good, guys. Well, hey, just in the interest of time, I'm going to transition this because we literally could go on for hours on talking on this subject, and we will, throughout this whole series, be delving more into religious liberty issues. Let's go to the review section. What's caught our attention? What are we reading that we think people should be aware of?
Well, let's jump in
Yeah.
by Andrew's choice. I spent my week with Greg Bonson's book, Theonomy and Christian Ethics. And this is, I've been aware of theonomy for a long time, but this is the first time I did a deep dive. The book's like 600 pages. And working through their thought, just a couple of quick things. One, it is amazing. The parts where Bonson and theonomy generally cohere with the kind of Protestant Reformed tradition, it's excellent. His treatment of justification is excellent. His discussion about the purpose of the Old Covenant and how the gospel is superior to the Old Covenant was excellent. But then, obviously, especially as a Baptist, but where theonomists differ from most Protestants is their insistence that Jesus, rather than fulfilling the law, and as Paul says, Christians no longer being under the law, that their contention is that Christians are bound to continue, even to the present, to keep the tenets of the Mosaic law. And not only that, but that they insist the civil magistrate is responsible for enforcing the tenets of the Mosaic law upon civil society. And, as a Baptist, we just spent a long time talking about how that is a flat contradiction of one of our most important beliefs. And so anyway, it was a really interesting week hanging out with that. And if you want to do a deep dive into theonomy, rather than reading Greg Bonson, I would say Andrew actually has a really great essay at TGC on this topic. And I read it in preparation for this. And so that'll give you pretty much, I think, everything you need to know.
Casey, what about you, man?
So I got two recommendations, one related to public theology and the one for the pastors that are tuned in. I have a growing interest in understanding how we use the Bible in public theology and what that means in terms of shaping our understanding, in terms of that we might be equipped for the work of ministry that we've been called to. One of them gentlemen that's been really helpful with that regard has been Richard Bauckham. He's got a few books, one on using the Bible politically, but then also this book, The Bible in the Contemporary World. And one of the things I just appreciate, not only is he a scholar, but he helps us think through how the Word of God, it's not just a privatizing of religion. The Bible actually speaks to contemporary issues and helps us think through the best way to formulate a worldview. So I found that to be beneficial. I'm revisiting that as I think through more of how we can use the Bible in public life. Mm-hmm. And then for the pastors that are out there that are interesting, always looking for a book recommendation, this one's going to be a little bit different probably, but it's a book called The Shepherd's Life by James Rebanks. He is actually a shepherd. And it's not a Christian book per se, but it is a book that's talking about a modern day shepherd in England. And I just found some really helpful things in it. One of the things he talked about that I think is interesting regarding our evangelical culture is he talked about how within the community of shepherds, it's one of the gravest sins a shepherd could commit would be to steal the sheep of another shepherd. And it was disgraceful among the shepherds in England. And as I've thought about how often church growth strategies are built upon attracting people from other churches that are dissatisfied as opposed to reaching truly lost people. I was just struck as I was reading that account this week of how among shepherds there ought to be a camaraderie where we recognize that we are stewards of sheep. And so I ought not look at people across the street that are already Christians, that are already at a church and say, hey, you know what, I would love for you to come to my church in kind of a sheep stealing way, but say, you know what, I'm grateful that you are where you're at. I hope you flourish while you're there, and recognize that we are ultimately shepherds that work underneath the great shepherd, and that we are stewarding his sheep, and wherever his sheep are, we ought to be praying and encouraging their growth and flourishing. So those are probably the two things I've been spending a little time in this week, and would recommend to those that are looking for a book on the Bible and public life, and then just something good for their soul regarding the work of pastoral ministry.
Yeah, good. So, I'll be brief with this. I was reading a Cambridge companion volume to the work of John Calvin, and I'm working on a book right now on natural law. And one of the things I've been wrestling with is, and this is especially true in Calvin, is how how do we say that the natural law exists in light of the suppression of the moral law because of sin? We suppress the truth and unrighteousness. And this scholar, because, well, let me back up. Calvin obviously has a very, very strong doctrine of human depravity, but he also has a strong doctrine on the existence of the natural law. So then how do you square that? That sounds like it's contradictory, right? Well, this scholar makes the argument that there's a distinction between the severity of the loss of particular types of knowledge for Calvin. So commands 1 through 4 of the 10 commandments are more obliterated for Calvin, so that man is inescapably rebellious and cut off from God. We would still say that man has some knowledge of God just because of general revelation, but like there is rebelliousness and wrath between man and God. But then the scholar says in commands 5 through 10, that's a different type of knowledge. That's pertaining to knowledge within the civil order. So knowledge pertaining to family life, to truth, to basic justice, honoring one's marital vows. And he makes the argument that that knowledge has been obscured by sin, but it's not been obliterated in the way that the knowledge of God has been obliterated with commands 1 through 4. And I found that to be a really interesting division to think through that, because in my own studies, everybody in some capacity is abiding by the natural law. Even pagans have some knowledge of right and wrong. But we would also say pagans have no relationship with the triune God. So how do we understand their knowledge being completely obliterated here, but yet retaining some moral knowledge over there? And I just thought this was such a helpful division for my own thinking through this subject. Well, guys, we're getting near the very end. This is time for the revelry. What's a fun thing? Could be a cultural item, something funny, a tweet. What caught your attention that's just kind of something that you think should be passed on?
Well, I'll just give you the revelry for me hasn't happened yet. Listen, if you know anything about Andrew or myself or Casey is probably the only true sports enthusiast in the group. The Super Bowl is coming this Sunday, and I always watch it as a group event. I'm here mostly for the commercials.
Me too.
Not even usually the halftime show. But the thing that caught my event is that Dr. Dre was talking about how he tried to will this outcome leading up to the Super Bowl, just kind of speak it into existence or whatever. And one of my friends who's predictably outraged by such things couldn't resist the opportunity to jump in and say how ridiculous it was. But anyway, America's going to get Dr. Dre at the Super Bowl in the halftime show.
Yeah.
And he willed it to happen. So I'll be watching the commercials, and I guess go Bengals.
Casey, what about you, man?
Yeah, so a little bit related to that. So I don't actually care a ton about the NFL. I really enjoy college sports. So with that said, my favorite college teams tend to be from Louisiana. I'm from Louisiana. So I have just really enjoyed watching the coverage of Joe Burrow and his success, whether he wins or not. He's a guy who's hard to dislike in terms of just his mentality and his approach to football. I think that one of the things I really liked was, I saw the news maybe yesterday. I think it happened before that though, but he went back and I think he went and found his high school coach and made sure that his high school coach had Super Bowl tickets. And so all my boys play sports, and so often, I was just thinking last night as I was watching my oldest son play baseball, like you've got these coaches that are grinding and helping kids, and like it's a thankless job many times. And so just the thought that here's this high school coach that invested in Joe Burrow, who given the statistics, it's so unlikely that a kid that you coach is going to not only make it to the league, but if they make it to the league, be anything special in the league. And I appreciate the fact that Joe Burrow went and brought him tickets. And it just reminds me of the importance of little things and how we don't always have an idea of the investment and the impact we're making in the life of someone. It could be many, many years later. So I really, really liked seeing that. And I hope that the Bengals win. If they don't, I think that Burrow's going to have a few more opportunities in his career to go. And so it's neat times.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Casey. I don't follow sports really at all, but I've caught enough of the Joe Burrow phenomenon to think he's kind of an interesting character to watch. And here in Louisville, we're an hour and a half from Cincinnati, so definitely rooting for the Bengals. But really, I'm rooting for the chicken wings and smoked sausage that I know is going to be at my house come Sunday from Dustin Bruce.
That's what I'm talking about.
The thing that I would point you all towards, I'm really big into soundtracks. And John Williams is one of my favorite composers. And then not only that, I have this. Is it a Germanophile? I don't know what you want to call it. I love German culture, German art, and I just discovered this on Spotify. There's now a concert of John Williams conducting the Berlin Philharmoniker on all of his famous tracks, and it's out. And it's wonderful. So go look up John Williams with the Berlin Philharmoniker. It's delightful hearing all of his great tunes put with one of the greatest orchestras or symphonies in the world. So everyone, that concludes our first episode of the Free Church, Free State podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Free Church, Free State podcast. Please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform, share it with others, and leave us a review. Thanks again for listening.